Well, thank you very much for that introduction. Before I start my talk, I would like to also just take a moment to thank Andreas for what I think is the best, most spectacular, most intellectually stimulating conference I have ever been to. So I'd like us to give Andreas a hand. Thank you so much. Thank you very much. I've spent a fair portion of my professional career studying strategies of human mating, and every time I think I've figured out everything there is to know, I find out I'm wrong, and there's more to discover. So what I'm going to do today is just present a few highlights of some of the work that I've done and my fellow colleagues have done on strategies of human mating. Those of you who are interested in more detail can check out the book. Now, Andres mentioned desire, and I view desire as lying at the foundation of the whole mating system. Our desires determine not only who we are attracted to, our desires also determine what tactics are effective in attracting the people that we want to attract. If you want to get into conflict with members of the opposite sex, violate their desires. Harmony between the sexes, fulfillment of desire. Causes of mate expulsion, getting rid of a bad mate. Good way to do it, violate their desires. So we have to understand what the desires are of men and women in order to understand all the various aspects of the human mating system. And I want to tell you a little bit about the theoretical background, and it picks up on some of the themes that Steve Pinker talked about, that Judith Lipton talked about, that Dr. Shermer talked about, and others, also Dan Dennett, evolution by selection. But I want to focus on something slightly different. Most people, when they think about evolution by selection, they think about cliches like nature red in tooth and claw, individuals struggling for mere survival. And in fact, that was part of what Darwin meant by natural selection, and in fact, in his early formulation, he even called it survival selection, and dealt with the adaptations that arose because of the survival advantage that they gave organisms. But in fact, Darwin was very troubled by phenomena that could not be explained by the so-called survival selection. He had notice a very interesting thing that I try to teach my graduate students. He noticed that he had a tendency to forget facts that were inconsistent with his theory. And so he developed a separate notebook where he forced himself to write down facts that were inconsistent with his theory. And two of them were puzzling phenomena and sex differences. Puzzling phenomenon, number one, the brilliant plumage of peacocks. How could this possibly have given an organism, the peacock, a survival advantage? It's not. It's bad for survival. It's like a neon sign saying free fast food. It's bad for survival. How could this weird, metabolically expensive structure possibly have evolved? Darwin even noted, he said, the sight of the peacock gives me nightmares. He was very troubled by the fact that his theory could not explain this. He also noticed things like this: sexual dimorphism. Differences in the size, shape, morphology of males and females within the same species. So up at the top here, these are Hamadryas baboons. You can see the alpha male here. I guess it would be the analog of Andres there. And the males are about twice the size of the females on average. So they have a fair amount of sexual dimorphism, but not as much as the sea lions, who are the species at the bottom panel. The sea lions, the males, weigh on average 4,000 pounds. The females weigh on average 1,000 pounds. And so there's a 4-to-1 ratio of males to females in terms of size. So what troubled Darwin about this was this: both sexes face the same survival problems. Both sexes have to eat. Both sexes have to thermoregulate if they're warm-blooded. Both sexes have to fend off predators. Why would the sexes differ was the first question. And then the second was, what causal process could explain variation across species in the magnitude of sexual dimorphism? And it was in response to these anomalies and puzzles that Darwin created what he, what he believed to be a second theory of evolution, the theory of sexual selection. And I want to explain a little bit about what sexual selection is and then go to some empirical data. Sexual selection deals with the evolution of characteristics not because of the survival advantage that they give organisms, but rather because of the mating advantage. And Darwin identified two component processes of sexual selection. The first is intrasexual or same-sex competition. And the logic of intrasexual competition is, this is a stereotypic image of it. Okay, two stags locking horns in combat. The victor, the winner, gets sexual access to the female. The loser ambles off with a broken antler, very dejected, with low self-esteem and probably needing Professor Lipton's psychotherapy. The logic, very simple but very powerful. Whatever qualities lead to success in these same-sex contests, those qualities get passed on in greater numbers. Qualities associated with losing basically bite the evolutionary dust and fail to get passed on. And so you see change over time, which is simple, that's what evolution means, change over time, simply by virtue of the preferential passing on of the qualities associated with victory. Okay, now the logic is more general than just applying to physical or what's called contest competition. The logic, for example, in our species, has to do with, in part, status hierarchy negotiation. So we compete with each other for position in status hierarchies. Position in status hierarchies in human groups is always associated with greater access to resources, greater access to desirable mates, greater access to food, greater access to health care, etc. And so individuals don't have to fight for this logic to work. So this is intrasexual competition. The second is intersexual selection, preferential mate choice. We are faced with an astonishing variety of people who differ on an astonishing variety of characteristics. On what basis should we make a choice? The process that Darwin identified had this logic. If members of one sex, let's say females, because Darwin even called this process female choice, if members of one sex agree with one another, if they have a consensus about the qualities that they desire in members of the opposite sex, then those who possess the desired qualities have a mating advantage. They get preferentially chosen. Those lacking the desired qualities get shunned, get banished, get excluded from mating, and hence also bite the evolutionary dust. So, for example, if it were the case that all women preferred to mate with men with red hair, and this process occurred generation after generation, then this whole room would be ablaze with redheads. And it's clearly not. There are a few, but it clearly hasn't been a predominant female preference. But you see the logic. Now, just one 20-second bit of history. This is all old hat as I'm presenting it. This is Darwin, 1871. Biologists at the time thought this was the stupidest idea they've ever heard. They said, Mr. Darwin, we can go along with you on the same-sex competition, but female choice, women actually influencing the direction of the evolution of a species, preposterous. And so the theory of sexual selection was largely ignored by biologists for the next 100 years. And it wasn't until basically 1972 when Robert Trivers developed one of the first major advance in understanding sexual selection, which was the theory of parental investment in sexual selection that Judith Lipton described. So the study of sexual selection, the theory of sexual selection has emerged now in evolutionary biology and in evolutionary psychology to be one of the most powerful, most profound theories that we have. Okay, now I want to push on here. Basically, let's see, did I go? I think I skipped something here. Yeah, I just wanted to make the point that we have, in my view, not a single mating strategy, but a menu of mating strategies. We have long-term mating, committed mating, with the emotion of love. We have short-term mating. We have what we call in the business EPCs, extra-pair copulations, mating with someone outside of your regular pair bond. We have serial mating, as Judith mentioned, mating with one person, things breaking up, followed by perhaps a bout of short-term mating, and then mating with another person, another bout of short-term mating, and then another person. And then humans are good at mixing and matching. We sometimes like to pursue a variety of mating strategies depending on our personal circumstances and our mate value, the culture that we live in, the sex ratio in the available mating pool, etc. Okay, now I want to talk a little bit about sex differences. Our reproductive biology differs in profound ways, and these are some of the most profound ways in which they differ. One, fertilization occurs internally within the female, not within the male. This poses an adaptive problem for males that no woman has ever faced, and that is the problem of paternity uncertainty. Mothers are always 100% sure that they are the mothers of their children. No mother ever gave birth, as far as I'm aware, and as the child is emerging from her body, wondered, gee, is this kid really my own? No, it never happened. Men can never be sure. Some cultures describe this with the phrase, they say, mama's baby, papa's maybe. Obligatory 9-month pregnancy. This is a metabolic cost women incur, men do not. And this creates asymmetries, differences between the sexes, in the payoff of different sexual strategies. Breastfeeding, another cost. Cryptic or concealed ovulation. Ovulation, in contrast to our chimpanzee relatives, where ovulation occurs within the context of estrus, females have very visible bright red genital swellings, and you can see them a football field away. In our species, we can't really tell when females ovulate, although I did have a male graduate student who claimed that he could detect when women were ovulating. He claimed he could walk into a bar and know, oh yes, she is ovulating, she is not, she is. But it turned out he often was boastfully deceptive about other things as well. So there is actually some recent evidence that ovulation is not totally concealed, but it's relatively concealed, at least compared to primates, and then it's cyclic in nature. I'm going to get back to that point. Okay, I want to talk a little bit about long-term mating and then shift to short-term mating. Okay, this has to do with, these are the 37 cultures that I studied in the context of long-term mating desires. And I was interested in the question, what do men and women want? What do they desire in a long-term mate? And I'm just going to give you a nutshell of the findings. I examined 32 different characteristics, and these are some that everybody everywhere desired. Everyone wanted love, and this actually violated an assumption in the social sciences that love was an invention by some white, Western European poets a couple hundred years ago. Turns out it's not true. Love is a human universal. You can go to the Kungsan in Botswana. You can go to the Aceh in Paraguay. You can go anywhere in the world, people fall in love, and they describe the same feelings that we experience when we fall in love. Exciting personality. People wanted someone in good health, kind, intelligent, sociable, easygoing. Perhaps not terribly surprising. No one wanted, let's say, a mean, ugly, disease-ridden mate who they weren't in love with. We also found things that were culturally variable, and this was the most culturally variable quality. Desire for virginity, desire for chastity, no prior sexual experience. And as you can see, the scale is +3, means this characteristic is indispensable in a mate, to 0 means it's irrelevant. Don't care about it at all. And as you can see, the Chinese, and these are mainland Chinese, we had 4 different samples, they said indispensable. And then, as you can see, there's tremendous variability. It goes to Sweden, and the Swedes hated this characteristic. They wrote on the questionnaire, bad, undesirable, we don't like it. So this is a quality that seems to be highly susceptible to cultural input. But we also found universal sex differences that coincided precisely with what we had predicted based on our evolutionary psychological hypotheses. One had to do with the importance that men placed more than women on physical appearance. From an evolutionary point of view, job one, if you're in the business world, job one is what they call it, is in the mating domain to find a fertile mate. But fertility of a female is not something that you can detect immediately. I can't look out into the room and see, oh, she's a fertile number 7, she's a fertile number 3, she's a fertile number 9. I can't detect that. All that selection can do, all that evolution can do, is pick up on cues that are statistically, recurrently associated with this underlying quality. And in fact, physical appearance provides a wealth of information about a woman's fertility status. Cues to youth, cues to health. We found that indeed, universally in all 37 cultures, men place a greater importance on physical appearance. As you'll see, if you can see from the graph, women care about it too, as they well should. Men just care about it more. Of course, one female graduate student of mine, when she saw this slide, she said, "David, I have a hypothesis that can explain these data." And I said, "What's that?" And she said, "Men are slime." I said, well, that might be, but they're slime in a very domain-specific way. It turns out, again, contrary to myths perpetrated by social scientists for decades, standards of beauty are not infinitely arbitrary. They're not infinitely cross-culturally variable. They are somewhat cross-culturally variable on, for example, the dimension of thin versus plump. But on many characteristics, those associated with health, those associated with youth, standards of beauty are the same across cultures. Waist-hip ratio, another fertility cue. I don't know if you can see the difference between these three figures, but this is based on studies that have used computer technology to create women with different waist-to-hip ratios. And basically, if you have a low waist-to-hip ratio, meaning that your waist is smaller compared to your hips, so a waist-hip ratio of, say, 0.7, that tends to be associated with higher fertility, and men find that more physically attractive. Age preferences. Men prefer younger women. Okay, perhaps not surprisingly, but this was the first study that actually documented that this is not a local or Western cultural phenomenon. This occurs across the globe. Okay, women's desires. Another universal sex difference. Good financial prospects. Women, and it's not that they're gold diggers, women are biologically designed to have that heavy metabolic investment in order to raise a child. They become the valuable reproductive resource over which males compete, and it's reasonable for you to ask the question, well, what would have aided, what would have helped our ancestral mothers to survive? What would have helped their children to survive? Picking a man who could reliably provide resources, who was a good hunter, who was committed to providing those resources over time, that would have been advantageous, and we are all the descendants of those successful ancestral mothers who made sure that their children did survive. And then the qualities associated with resource acquisition, status seeking, ambition, industriousness, hard work is in fact associated with resource acquisition and elevation in the status hierarchy. Now, I want to shift to short-term mating. I want to ask you a question. How many sex partners would you ideally like to have in the next 10 years? If I gave you your magic wish, okay, I am the king of the world, and I will give you your magic wish, just tell me what number you would like to have in the next 10 years. Okay, everybody's kind of quiet. 10? Okay, we have a 10. 1. Okay, well, we had 3 men in our sample who said they were like 1,000. But I don't have to ask you because we did this study. This is how many partners you'd like to have on the y-axis, and on the x-axis is the different time intervals. So what we found is that women, on average, in the next month would like to have 8/10 of a sex partner. This gradually escalated to a full sex partner at 6 months, and then 8 to 10 in a couple years, and 18 in the lifespan. And that was after deleting the 3 men from who said 1,000, because the data are skewed. At first I thought, well, that's ridiculous. No one would actually want 1,000, but it turns out that some men do. Okay, short-term mating creates sexual conflict. And I want to talk about 3 components of sexual conflict. I want to pick up on the notion of sexual infidelity, which Judith Lipton talked about. I want to talk about mate retention and mate guarding, because once you have infidelity, enter as a mating strategy. And I'm going to show you, well, let me back off for a second. The reason for this, that males, in fact, do have a greater desire for sexual variety, and this is one aspect in which I would disagree with Judith Lipton. There's a clear sex difference on that. I guess she did mention that. But it's a no-brainer. It's one of the largest sex differences that's ever been documented in the psychological literature. Men have a greater desire for sexual variety. They have what we call a sexual overperception bias. That is, woman smiles at a man, and man thinks, oh, she's sexually interested in me. And women said, no, I'm just being friendly. But men consistently over-infer sexual interest on the part of women. It's basically a no-brainer. And the evolutionary logic is very clear. Okay, that is, ancestral men who succeeded in gaining sexual access to fertile women would have enjoyed higher reproductive success than men who didn't. So the evolutionary rationale for men is very straightforward and clear-cut. It's a little bit more complicated when it comes to women. So I'm going to get into that in a minute. But once sexual infidelity enters as a mating strategy, once it becomes part of our menu of mating strategies in the human population, it will immediately select for defenses on the part of partners to prevent it from occurring. Hence, jealousy and mate guarding, inflicting costs on potential mate poachers, and then the mate poachers is another final topic that I want to touch on. I want to touch on that very briefly. Why are there mate poachers? What I mean by mate poachers are individuals who try to steal your mate, either for a short-term sexual encounter or for a longer-term relationship. And think about it this way. If you find your mate desirable, odds are other people do too. And in fact, desirable mates get snapped up very quickly in the mating pool. And so mate poaching turns out to be a fairly common tactic. Have you ever attempted to poach on someone else's mate? We find, a fair number of people report, yes, I have. Have you ever been the recipient? So you're in a relationship, and someone has tried to lure you out of that relationship for sex or a relationship. Well, most people report yes. Have you ever been successfully poached away? Well, here we find a sex difference here, and the 67% versus 41% is that men, let's get back to that issue of men, these are poaches for short-term mating. Men are more susceptible to being lured away for short-term encounters. So the key point that I want to make here is mate poaching is a very common strategy, and a former student of mine, David Schmidt, has documented that this occurs across the world. He did a massive study of 56 cultures and showed that it's a human universal. Okay, now in sexual infidelity tactics, how do women go about it? Well, we're just starting to study these, and so I just put down a couple hypothetical examples. She told the other guy to call me when her regular mate was out of town. She told her partner that she was spending a night out with the girlfriend. She told her partner she was going to La Ciudad des Ideas. So if you have a female friend who was supposed to be here who's not, that might raise an eyebrow. Okay, now, why would women do it? Why would women ever be unfaithful? Well, there are 3 leading hypotheses as to why. Judith Lipton mentioned one, potential access to resources. But there's another, and that's good genes. In the economics of the mating market, women can attract a more desirable short-term partner than she can a long-term partner. And so if a woman is mated to, let's say a woman is mated to a guy who's only a 5 on the 1 to 10 scale, she can obtain better genes from a male who's an 8 or a 9 by having sex with him, basically pursuing a mixed mating strategy, or what's sometimes called a dual mating strategy, securing the commitment of one man, securing the genes of another man. Of course, men who are or who are committing are not very happy about that. And then a third is trading up to a better partner. So now, is there evidence that we have defense mechanisms against this? Well, yes, there is. There's a ton of evidence that men and women differ in the weighting given to the cues of sexual jealousy. In other words, what triggers sexual jealousy in men and women? I put subjects in what I call the Sophie's choice of the jealousy dilemmas. I said, imagine your partner got interested in someone else. What would upset or distress you more? A, imagining your partner having sexual intercourse with that other person, trying out different sexual positions with that other person, or B, imagining your partner falling in love with that other person. What would upset you more? We found huge sex differences. Women more upset about the love and the emotional infidelity, which is a cue to the long-term diversion of resources. Men far more upset about the sexual aspects of the infidelity because it's the sex act that would jeopardize his certainty that he's the father. Okay, of course, men aren't thinking about this consciously. No man ever said, oh, let's see, my partner's having sex with someone else. That would jeopardize my reproductive success. Therefore, that makes me mad. No, it's an evolved psychological circuit that gets tripped, and men go berserk when they discover their partner in bed with another man. We've showed this in a variety of ways, physiological studies, fMRI studies, and so forth. These are, the point that I want to make here is that jealousy is an emotion that drives behavior, and the behavior that it drives is mate-guarding behavior. So what are the predictors of who devotes a lot of effort to mate guarding? Well, one is the perceived likelihood that the partner is unfaithful, and the other is, if you're a male, if you're mated with a physically attractive partner or a young female, males do more mate guarding. They devote more effort to solving the adaptive problem of mate guarding. Okay, now the last point that I want to cover has to do with getting back to that point of the ovulation cycle. And there's some very interesting findings that have been demonstrated with respect to this that relate to short-term mating and why women have affairs. Now I want to just point your attention to one. This is a study done by Stanislaw and Rice of women who are not taking oral contraceptives. Because oral contraceptives basically flatten out the surges in testosterone and estrogen and other hormones that cause variations. Among non-pill-taking women, there is a predictable increase in sexual desire that's associated with the ovulation cycle. Well, this is pretty interesting. Something is going on within women, even though men can't pick it up. Now, I'd like to ask you a question. If you're a woman in the audience, which man do you find the most attractive? Or let me put it this way, if you're a man in the audience, which one would you be more threatened with if he became best friends with your partner? Well, it turns out that the answer for women depends on their ovulation cycle. Women show predictable shifts in mate preferences when they ovulate. When they are ovulating, they approach that fertile window, they prefer men who are more masculine in facial appearance, more masculine in body morphology, and more masculine in vocal tone. They prefer a deeper pitched voice than when they're not ovulating. When they're not ovulating, they like the good dads. When they are ovulating, they go for the masculine, symmetrical guys, which are hypothesized to be cues to good genes. And there's a elaborate rationale for that. In studies that I've done on women, I ask women who have had affairs, what do you perceive the benefits to be of having an affair? And what women say is resources is one, but another big one is what I call the mate switching hypothesis. That is, women who have affairs are often unhappy with their regular relationship. They're sexually unhappy and emotionally unhappy. Now you may say, well, that's obvious. Of course people are unhappy if they have affairs. They're more likely to be unhappy, but it's not true of men. Men who have affairs compared to men who don't have affairs do not differ in marital happiness, but women do. And so women who have affairs are more likely to be engaged in a mate-switching strategy, using the affair as a means to exit one relationship, perhaps test the waters to see if there's a better mate out there for her, or perhaps they've identified a better mate and they're using the affair as a means of getting out of the relationship. And then also women say, perhaps not surprisingly, sexual gratification is something that I also get from affairs. So the hypotheses, these are the most compelling hypotheses. There have been about 16 hypotheses proposed about why women have affairs, and these are the three that receive the most empirical support so far, and all three could be right for different women under different circumstances. So I'd like to draw 4 conclusions. Okay, 1, humans have a complex menu of mating strategies. We don't just have one mating strategy. 2, mating strategies follow from desire. We have to know the desires of men and women, both in long-term mates, but also in short-term sexual encounters. What qualities do men and women find sexy, sexually desirable? And those are very different from what they find desirable in long-term contexts. Point 3, sexual conflict is pervasive. There's a conflict of interest, conflict of reproductive interest between a man and a woman, between a man and a mate poacher, and even between the woman and a mate poacher. Sexual conflicts of interest are pervasive in human social interaction. And this is important because some people, when they see these things, they say there's something wrong, there's a dysfunction going on. No, sexual conflict and these social conflicts are very predictable outcomes of knowledge of our mating strategies. And third, although it is true that men and women are similar, if not identical, on many desires, they do both desire love and kindness and intelligent and healthy mates, they also differ fundamentally in some aspects of their mating strategies. So that's just getting back to the peacock theme. Another cartoonist rendition of men and women. Thank you very much.